From the early centuries of Christianity, church leaders asserted that marriage was not merely a private contract between individuals, but a sacred institution ordained by God. Drawing on Pauline injunctions, it is better to marry than to burn with passion, and on patristic writings. Bishops and theologians claimed authority over the moral and ritual dimensions of wedlock. By the 5th century, local councils began issuing canons that defined who could marry, how marriages were blessed, and which sexual behaviors were permissible within the bond of matrimony. At the heart of ecclesiastical regulation lay two principles: procreative purpose and spiritual purity. The Church taught that every act of intercourse had to be open to the possibility of conception. Pleasure, while acknowledged as a secondary good to foster conjugal affection, could never become the primary motive. In effect, married couples were exhorted to reproduce God's image through offspring. Any attempt to thwart fertility via early forms of barrier methods, withdrawal, or herbal abortifacients was condemned as onanism or a deliberate reversal of divine will. Simultaneously, the Church established a calendar of prohibited days, spanning major liturgical seasons and weekly fasts. During Lent, Christmastide Ember Days, and the Wednesday and Friday commemorations of Christ's Passion, sexual relations between spouses were formally outlawed. Penitential manuals handbooks used by confessors listed these deadlines explicitly, warning that violation incurred the penalty of a light penance, or, for repeat offenders, a heavier penance. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the institutional church had built an elaborate machinery to enforce these rules. Parish priests questioned couples about their intimate habits during confession, eliciting details about timing, methods, and frequency. Concurrently, marriage itself became a sacrament starting with synods in the 11th and 12th centuries binding couples in ways that exceeded civil agreement. By the time of the Fourth Lateran Council, decrees affirmed that marriage required canonical form and barred clandestine unions. This formalization served dual purposes: to stabilize social order and to ensure that sexual relations, with all their moral weight, occurred within church-sanctioned bounds. Thus, by the High Middle Ages, medieval Christians viewed sexual taboos not as arbitrary bans, but as expressions of a divinely ordained discipline. To violate them was to challenge ecclesiastic and ultimately divine authority. In the next section, we will examine the most common categories of forbidden relations and their social ramifications. The medieval church's liturgical clock served as a sexual calendar, marking off dozens of days when married intercourse was forbidden. Beyond the major fasting seasons of Lent and Advent, the weekly fast days of Wednesday and Friday were strictly observed. Wednesday for the betrayal of Christ, Friday for the crucifixion. Ember Days quarterly periods tied to the changing seasons, as did extra fasts in spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Saints' feast days, too, could impose additional restrictions. Penitentials, the principal guides for confessors, codified these observances in meticulous lists. A common entry might read, "He who lies with his wife on a Sunday before vigils of St. Lawrence must fast for 3 days." Over time, these lists grew so numerous that devout couples calculated their forbidden zones with near mathematical precision. Some kept tally marks on church calendars, others consulted local clergy to confirm days. The risk of miscalculation was high. A single oversight could mean the difference between a light penance fasting from bread and wine for 3 days and a heavy one demanding pilgrimages to distant shrines. Social gossip often centered on couples rumored to flaunt these rigors. Village scolds and chaplains traded stories of noblemen who cavorted with their wives on Ember Saturdays after a feast, or peasants who found inventive workarounds to satisfy desire. Church courts sometimes prosecuted flagrant offenders, imposing public penances standing, barefoot in the snow, or walking in white robes through the marketplace while confessing their sin. Yet strict regulation bred both piety and parody. Some medieval theologians wrote treatises on the just causes for marital intercourse: procreation, mutual support, avoidance of sin. Others penned satirical poems about hypochondriacal couples who refused all intimacy for fear of incurring penance. A famous 13th century cleric joked that a newlywed could spend her entire honeymoon in blocks of alternating 9-day fasts and 9-day feasts, never once sharing a bed. On a deeper level, the proliferation of forbidden days reflected the Church's desire to sanctify time itself. By structuring the laddies' daily lives around divine rhythm, ecclesiastical authorities aim to transform even marihaja, fundamental human institution, into a vehicle for spiritual growth. The body, its appetites, and its procreative power were enlisted in service of a higher order. Medieval canon law prohibited marriage between blood relatives up to a certain degree of affinity. Initially set at the 7th degree by early councils, the measure was later reduced to the 4th degree by the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. This meant that anyone related as great-grandchildren or closer could not wed. The diagrams in canonical collections delineated these forbidden degrees like a genealogical spiderweb, casting a wide net over noble and peasant families alike. Affinity extended beyond blood ties. If a man married a widow, he could not marry his former wife's blood sister. If he consummated that marriage, he was guilty of incest by affinity. Similar rules applied to godparent-godchild relationships. A man could not marry his godmother or goddaughter, for spiritual sponsorship mimicked kinship. These prohibitions had profound social implications. Aristocratic families depended on marriage alliances to secure land and power. A failure to observe kinship rules could lead to annulment, loss of dowry, and political scandal. Chroniclers record numerous cases of noble unions being dissolved years later. When a relative at a distance previously unknown protested to the bishop, such disputes sometimes dragged on for decades, tarnishing reputations and fueling feuds. Peasant communities, too, felt the weight of kinship laws. In small villages where everyone descended from a handful of founders, the pool of eligible spouses grew alarmingly thin. Local priests often granted dispensations for a fee to permit matches within the 4th degree, especially when land inheritance was at stake. These little marriages required the signatures of multiple bishops and sometimes a papal license. Written registers of such dispensations survive in cathedral archives. One 14th-century volume records how a farmer in southern France paid a tithe to wed his second cousin, explaining that, without the marriage, his lands would pass to a distant cousin who lived abroad. Church officials, mindful of both pastoral care and financial gain, routinely approved these requests while warning couples that any further kinship infringements would result in excommunication. What emerges is a picture of a church deeply invested in controlling the genetic and social makeup of Christendom. Sexual taboos, far from mere ascetic ideals, became tools for maintaining property rights, forging alliances, and delineating community boundaries. From the 12th century onward, the sacrament of confession evolved into a primary mechanism for enforcing sexual norms. Parish priests often barely educated used standardized manuals to guide their questioning. These questiones ranged from the innocuous to the intrusive. Penitentials cautioned priests to approach delicate topics with a mixture of firmness and tact. A common rubric advised: if the penitent blushes or hesitates, proceed gently, for excessive shame may hinder true contrition. Yet records from diocesan synods revealed that some confessors adopted a more aggressive stance, believing that detailed admission was necessary for absolution. Women, in particular, reported feeling humiliated when asked to recount their unclean days and methods of self-denial. Men faced fewer personal barriers but were sometimes embarrassed by queries regarding nocturnal emissions or sinful fantasies. The outcome of confession was a penance-prescribed act of restitution. For a single violation of a prohibited day, a couple might be told to fast for 3 days. For repeated or more grave offenses, such as using abortifacients or incestuous unions, the penance could include public humiliation. Some offenders were required to walk barefoot through the town on Palm Sunday, wearing a white sheet and carrying a lighted candle. Public penances served both as punishment and deterrent. The faithful witnessed the spectacle and were reminded of church oversight over even the most private acts. Moreover, local statutes sometimes supplemented ecclesiastical penalties. In parts of Italy, church and civic tribunals imposed fines for sexual infractions, funneling revenue back into cathedral construction or the relief of the poor. Despite the often harsh measures, some confessors showed pastoral flexibility. Letters between bishops recount cases where a husband's chronic illness left him physically unable to consummate the marriage within canonical days, prompting a dispensation. Others gave lighter penances to first offenders, hoping to integrate penitents back into the community rather than alienate them. By the late medieval period, manuals such as the Summa Confessorum provided extremely detailed tables, one axis for the gravity of the offense, the other for the number of times committed. These tables underscored the Church's view that sexual regulation was central to moral life. Medieval sermons and literature reveal a cultural ambivalence towards sexual pleasure. On one hand, authors of ascetic tracts described the body as a foul cage, whose desires needed constant vigilance. On the other, troubadours and courtly poets celebrated romantic longing, sometimes extending marital imagery into ecstatic, almost mystical realms. This tension between doctrine and desire shaped how the people experienced their own bodies. Courtly love literature, though ostensibly about non-marital affection, often informed married couples' understanding of intimacy. Manuscripts circulated stories of noblemen who preferred the ethereal beauty of an unattainable lady to the mundane duties of wife and hearth. Clergy decried such works as poison to the soul, yet they remained popular in courts from Aquitaine to Castile. Art and iconography, too, reflected these conflicting attitudes. Illuminated manuscripts might depict the Annunciation in one folio and a hunting scene in the margins. Church carvings at times showed Adam and Eve in the act of procreation, perhaps as moral warnings, perhaps as reminders of human origin. Lay audiences negotiated these images, deriving personal meaning for their own marital relations. Where doctrine clamped down, folklore and popular belief found loopholes. Rural communities held beliefs in love-enhancing herbs, mandrake for fertility, mugwort for passion. Midwives and wise women, some later accused of witchcraft, sold concoctions said to ward off impotence or induce menstruation to reset the calendar of forbidden days. The Church vehemently opposed these practices, equating them with devilish sorcery. Despite the Church's best efforts, many couples employed subtle strategies to skirt the rules. Some timed intercourse to just after midnight on a forbidden day, arguing that the boundary of a day's fast technically ended at dawn. Others claimed ignorance of the liturgical calendar, though local priests often viewed such defenses with skepticism. By the 15th century, humanist thinkers began to critique the excessive sexual regulations. Italian humanist Baldassare Castiglione, in his book of the Courtier, argued that marital love should be both procreative and pleasurable, admonishing that too much guilt undermined genuine affection. Yet even reformers stopped short of advocating full sexual freedom. They proposed moderation, education, and mutual consent rather than blanket prohibitions. The Council of Trent reaffirmed medieval sexual norms even as Europe entered the Renaissance. Trent codified the sacramental nature of marriage, insisted on clerical oversight, and reiterated the sinfulness of contraception. Yet the intellectual currents of humanism, Protestant Reformation, and scientific inquiry began to erode the medieval stranglehold on sexual ethics. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther rejected celibacy and sought to normalize marital sex, though they maintained prohibitions against adultery and incest. Lutheran territories abolished many penitential practices, favoring pastoral care over public shaming. Meanwhile, Catholic counter-reformers tightened pastoral control in some regions, but also encouraged confession as a path to grace rather than merely discipline. By the 17th century, state churches in places like England and Sweden had assumed many functions once held by the medieval penitential system. Civil marriage ceremonies replaced purely ecclesiastical ones, and copious parish registers tracked births and deaths more than sins. Yet remnants of medieval taboos endured. Sunday observance laws, codes against bestiality and sodomy, and anxieties over illegitimacy. The Enlightenment challenged the entire premise of pleasure as morally suspect. Thinkers such as Voltaire, Rousseau, and later human sexuality researchers reframed sex as a natural human faculty, deserving rational understanding. In the 19th century, mounting critiques of Victorian prudery would spark new debates over birth control, marital privacy, and women's rights. Looking back, we see that medieval sexual taboos were neither mere superstition nor unenforced idealism. They formed a coherent system that shaped personal psychology, social structures, and even political alliances. While subsequent eras reinterpreted or rejected aspects of the medieval legacy, the basic questions remain. What is the rightful boundary between private desire and public morality? Who has authority to define that boundary? And how can societies balance the demands of procreation, pleasure, and spiritual aspiration. These questions, first articulated in the Middle Ages, continue to resonate. As we've traced the medieval church's relentless efforts to regulate marital intimacy through calendars, kinship laws, confession, and penance, we gain perspective on our own era's struggles with sexual ethics. Ultimately, the story of medieval taboos reminds us that the most private acts are never wholly divorced from the broader currents of power, belief, and community.